Welcome to Connection Requested. I'm your host, Mark Tweddle, co-founder of YouTellYours.com. I started this podcast because I just couldn't understand the reason for social media friends, followers, and in particular, those LinkedIn connection requests. But it doesn't really matter which platform they're on, they just didn't seem to make the meaningful connections that I seek in my life. And so this podcast is all about showing how simple storytelling can produce the stronger connections that we seek in our lives. This week my guest is Dr. Howard Gluss. He's a good friend. So let's get him started straight away with the 2-minute story of his name.
Well, my name is Howard Gluss, and I'm actually Dr. Howard Gluss, and I bring that up because there's a few things about my name. Actually, becoming Howard was something that happened to me in school, because when I was a kid, my parents would call me Howie, or they would call me Herschel, which was my Yiddish and Hebrew name, and I always associated that with being a child. And so I was very excited to go to school where I was finally called Howard, because it made me feel older and more grown up. And I used to resent my parents calling me Howie or Herschel, come here. But what was interesting about that, the reason I bring up the doctor part, is the first time I actually became a doctor, I was working in a home for schizophrenics. There was 64 patients that we had, and many times the patients would call me Dr. Howie, especially when I arrived for the beginning of the day. I'd come in my car and they'd run out to the parking lot and say, Dr. Howie, Dr. Howie. I actually started to really enjoy that. It was very endearing. It brought us a lightness. It brought us a connection that I wasn't expecting. So I went full circle and ended up realizing that calling myself Dr. Howie was something that I liked to do. So I went from a place of not liking Howie to actually really loving Howie, and found it, like I said, very endearing and very connecting. So I worked at this facility for about 4 years, and I was formally known as Dr. Howie. I never told him about the Herschel part. I wasn't ready to go there, but I finally was able to be proud of this fact that I was Dr. Howie and I was able to own it.
Is there anything happens with Gluss? What do people do with Gluss? Is that just is it because it's so easily spelled, or what?
People get it wrong all the time.
Did you get hounded as a child for it?
No, but I didn't get hounded for it, but you'd be surprised with such a simple name how often people get it wrong. They would say to me, especially when I have to spell it. So they would say a lot of times Gluff, like Gluff, or they say glass. And I always have to tell people that it's Gluss. And many times people ask me, well, what is that? I've never heard of that name. I said, well, my parents had a European ancestry, and I believe I was told by my father it came from the German word Gluss, which means glass. So then they would say to me, well, why is it not glass? And I would say, because it's Gluss, and that's the way it's pronounced. When my father came to Canada, where I'm from, he and 2 of his brothers, all 3 of them came at the same time, and they didn't speak English. So whoever was giving them their immigration papers didn't really understand what they said. So I had an uncle that was Gluz, Glu like Gluz. We are Gluss, and my other uncle was Gluss, Glus. So it's interesting that they all got it wrong when they were basically checking into Canada. So
that's cool.
With such a short name, and there is Gluss Islands in Scotland. I used to look up my name on Google, but even before that, in the World Book or the encyclopedia we used to get, and I found there were Gluss Islands off of Scotland. So I thought, well, maybe I have a Scottish background. Maybe we're related. Who knows?
Well, I don't know that my ancestors went that far. They were always on the border of England and Scotland. I've got to look that up and just
I'm
find out where that is. Yeah, Gluss Island, Shetland Islands. I mean, that's far. My dad's been to the Shetland Islands. That's like off the north coast of Scotland.
So I used to imagine that maybe I owned an island and we came from royalty. And so I would call these pictures Scottish royalty, but that wasn't the truth.
Have you ever watched Shetland? There's a detective series, a BBC detective series called Shetland. And you'll see what it's like up there. It's really beautiful. A bit like most kind of detective things. It just seems like everybody's getting murdered all the time.
We got to start off with a good murder, and then you never know where you're going to go from there.
Absolutely. Because it's Scotland, it is a proper murder.
Yes.
It's not any of your murders.
It could be all 4 people on the island. We have to investigate who it could be.
Yeah.
The hundreds of sheep might have done it.
Yeah. Cool. I'm going to ask you to do another story, and then we can do a sort of proper chat. So the next one I'm going to do is 2 minutes on, it's a beginning story. So all I do is give you the beginning, and then you just go wherever that leads you, yeah? And so the beginning is my first job, okay? So I'll give you a second to have a think about that, but are you ready?
Yes.
Here we go.
Well, my first job was at Saul's Cigar Store in Montreal, where I grew up. Saul was actually one of our neighbors, and he owned what we used to call in Canada a cigar store, which was basically a 5 and dime type of general store. I used to go in on every Sunday, and I would work for him, and I'd stock stuff for him and put magazines and all this kind of stuff. And the funny story happened is one time he gave me the wrong box. So the magazines that I was supposed to put up, I was way too young. Let's leave it at that. I was way too young to be able to look at them. So they were adult magazines. And I took them out of the box and I started to put them up. And I was so young that I think I must have been about 12 or 13. And as I started to put them up, he freaked out and came running back. I think he was terrified I would tell my parents or anything like that. But I didn't even, I was so young, I didn't even realize what was going on. So that was kind of an interesting story that the first job that I had, I tell people I kind of worked in the adult industry as a child. And that really, confuses people, but it wasn't exact. And I used to enjoy going out there. I'd go every Sunday for at least, I think it was a couple of years. And then I ended up getting a more formal job as a shoe salesman on the weekends.
Thank you for that. I just thought it'd be a good question to ask you, a good story for you to tell, because everything that you put out in the world is all about, therapy and...
But it's true. I worked in adult. It ended up being like girly magazine. I'm putting them away and he's like, oh my God.
Well, they used to have great articles in them from what I remember, what I heard from people.
Yeah, that's why I bought Pentas.
Yeah.
Right.
So the podcast is all about connection. It's a subject for me that never seems to have a bottom to it. I just keep diving in and it just sort of expands into this infinite world. And sometimes I think of it as human beings shouldn't be the dominant force in the world that they are, because we're kind of rubbish. We can't fight that well. If you come up against a tiger, it's not going to work out so well. Right. If you try to sort of hunt with only your own hands, your own body, all the rest of it, it's all a bit tricky. And the only reason we're on top of the world, really, on the food scale and all the rest of it, is because we talk to each other, because we tell our stories to each other, means that we share knowledge, which means that they can then create more and more complex tools and systems and processes and ways of working with each other, so that there's no animal that can kind of outdo us. We're pretty much the dominant force on the world. And I think that's all down to our connection, our stories. And so what I wanted to talk to you about was, when I say the word connection, what does that mean to you? Is there a word that as a therapist you consider more?
When I hear the word connection, I think of this concept that it's sort of a dual relationship, that I am connecting to myself and what my feelings are. And through that process of connect to myself, which gives me a sense of how I look at the world, then I try to connect externally to the world. So I go internal first and then external. And the many times the relationship that is connecting to someone, I always think that it's something in the middle, that it's their subjectivity of what they're projecting onto me, my subjectivity of what I'm projecting onto other people. We're forming this new reality that's somewhere in the middle. And I try to understand what that reality is. Visually, I look at it like two lights coming together and an orb is forming in the middle. So when I try to connect with people, I'm always looking for what's the mutual understanding that we're both having. And I look to my emotions and feelings as a way of connecting someone, because a lot of time the content of what we're talking about is not as important as what the feeling is that we're trying to express to each other. So it's a marriage. Yeah, I shouldn't say it's not as important, but it's a marriage of both.
The studies that go into how much you take away from, say if someone was doing a PowerPoint presentation or whatever, so they're doing this presentation, if they do that presentation and do it with bullet points and facts, you will take virtually nothing away from it.
Exactly.
But if they do it in terms of using storytelling and they do tell compelling stories that trigger your emotions, then you remember so much more of that presentation. So yeah, the content side of it, it's kind of interesting where you talk about the difference between data and the feelings that were sort of transmitted and received.
Yeah, the emotional experience. When I'm sitting with a patient, I'm always trying to monitor what's going on for me internally. That's my database. So if I feel like I'm starting to disconnect, like a patient's talking to me, and my mind is starting to wander, I'm disconnecting, chances are that two things are happening. Either I'm experiencing the disconnection of the patient, that they're starting to get disconnected in the process, and I'm going with them in that process, experiencing their disconnection, or I'm actually starting to disconnect because I'm feeling uncomfortable about what might be being said, or I'm not finding a way to make it resonate. So it's maybe more of my experience. So actually, Mark, the experience of disconnection for me can be very powerful too, because it lets me know that something is going on. When I've worked with patients that are schizophrenic, a lot of times when you're with them in the room, you could, after a while, experience this great fatigue or disconnection, and you feel as though you just want to lie down and go to sleep, or you start to feel very confused. And I've learned over time that a lot of that confusion I'm experiencing, I'm picking up from the patient I'm working with. So even disconnection can give me a lot of great valuable information.
So an insight into the patient. I'm also interested, when people come to you, obviously some people see you with all sorts of issues that are substance related or sort of physical in some respects, not entirely just
relationship related, whatever they're going through.
But I'm just wondering how much of your work isn't to do with connection. Is connection the real reason why people end up going to see a therapist?
I think that connection is a big reason why people come see a therapist, because if you look at the idea, let's say, of addiction, there's a lot of people out there that believe addiction is an illness of isolation. Yeah. And isolation a lot of times is an illness of disconnection. So when you're working with a client or a patient who is experiencing addiction, one of the aspects you might be working on is, in a sense, to get them connected to themselves. And then through that connection to self, then get connection to the world, have them see that there are alternatives to being isolated, because the attachment a lot of times is so difficult. Connection is such an integral part of treating a patient, because I always believe that somewhere along the line, they got disconnected. Something didn't work for them. And maybe they started panicking. Maybe they started experiencing a lot of anxiety, depression, whatever, and it just escalated. So at the core, I agree with everything you're saying and doing, is getting people back to that powerful connection is just fundamental. From there, you can do a lot of other work. But if you don't have that, you're really not going to have anything.
The other thing that you keep saying that I think is really interesting.
It's not all interesting.
No, I said, did I just say the other thing? It's all interesting. Yeah. But last season, what I did was I got everybody that I got on the show to do a 3-minute story about connection. And I gave them a very woolly description. And I said, if you really want something to start with, you could start with the thing about connection is. And I wasn't really sure whether people would say something very different from each other. In some respects, it was like an experiment on my part to find out if they all said the same thing or a really similar thing. And they didn't. 16 episodes and they all said something entirely different. And the last one, what she said was about connection. Lee Allison, she said that for her, connection was something that she realized was a problem, that she felt isolated and separate and not a part of, and that her route out of that was to understand herself. Her route out of that was self-love and self-understanding, which is absolutely what you're saying. And I don't know that most people would recognize that. I think we know that connection's an issue. The pandemic has made that very, very clear, that if you are isolated from people, connection can cause all sorts of weird things to your mental health. But I think part of that is this not understanding yourself, not accepting and being, as some people would say, compassionate to yourself, because your internal voice can be so
critical.
It can be critical. That PQ, positive intelligence, they talk about who are the saboteurs in your head, and understanding that voice isn't you, it's just a thought. It's not the same as you. And once you realize it's a thought and we give it a name, like this is the judge has turned back and told me that I'm rubbish at this, I'm dreadful at that. But I don't know that many people know that first step is that compassion for self. Is that, when you work with patients, is that something that, where do you start with them? How do you connect with them if the first part of connection is them connecting with themselves first?
When I'm working with a patient, the first and most important thing I got to do in the first few sessions is find a way to connect to the patient. So I don't worry so much about the content of what we're talking about. I try to use different methods to connect and make somebody comfortable in the office and comfortable with me. So I may use humor, storytelling, narrative storytelling. Listening is very important. A lot of people come into a therapy session because basically they feel no one's listening to them. So I also try to take the focus off of myself and be very mindful of everything that the person is doing and paying attention to that. So my goal, I almost, when I talk, I move my hands because and people can't see that, but my goal is almost to comfort someone and to hug them. I have this image in my head that I've got to create this warmth in this environment. I also have learned over the years that I do this thing a lot of times with patients where I may start with especially if someone's uncomfortable, with a little bit of meditation, just to ground them in the session. So I'll ask them to sit quietly. I'll talk them through a 2 or 3 minute meditation so we can shut out the outside world and all the noises they're hearing and get them focused in the room. I try to make sure they don't have their phones, etc. I find that to be a very powerful experience, and I'm finding it to be more and more discovering that for myself, and what I've learned from myself, I try to share with my clients. I do these walks to work, and I do them now as these walking meditations. I can try to connect deeply to my breath because I tend to be the kind of guy who has a lot of things going on and my head gets really muddled. And, I wake up in the morning and it's going in 14 different directions. So when I go to work, I do these mindful exercises where all I try to do, it's very simple. All I try to do is breathe, take deep breaths and stay focused on my breath, which is what you do in meditation. And it's amazing, Mark, how so many times it completely shifts my energy and it takes me away from all that chatter in my head and gets me focused on the things around me. I try to look at, literally, it sounds corny, like, what does that tree look like? What does, that squirrel look like? And it just has a very powerful experience of trying to stay in the moment. Connection to me is about being in the moment. So I have learned to mechanically do that too. Like when I see myself rushing or not being able to focus, or my thoughts are going quicker than I can process them, I start to focus on my breath and look at everything around me. And that mindful experience can be very powerful.
When people talk about listening and active listening, you're talking about, they'll often say something like that being fully present, like fully present is the only way that you can be truly listening, because otherwise you're listening to reply, or you're listening to be able to steer the conversation elsewhere, or you're listening to...
what do I have to say to be smart or funny or articulate, and just trust what you sort of are, just...
Waiting to speak. I don't really care what you're saying. I'm waiting for my turn. But the fact that what you're saying is you're doing this walking meditation and it allows you to be present, then you're going to arrive at your office or your surgery or whatever it is, and you want to call it, and then
Mental
be
surgery.
Present for your clients that you then want to properly listen to, be present so that you can hear them and help them.
Over the years, I've worked with clients who have stage fright, and I believe that is an experience of disconnection, that the person starts to get anxious. It's usually in the transition from being behind stage to getting in front of people. So it is that space in between where people get very anxious, because once they get on stage, if they're an experienced actor, they'll know how to connect to someone. But when they're backstage, they're not connected. What I've said is that you have to start the connection before you actually get on stage. You have to look at the other actors. You have to look at the experience and see if you're part of it. So the more you can take yourself out of your own anxiety and try to be in the moment and be in the experience, the more you'll be able to deal with the anxiety, whether it's public speaking or acting or anything that you're doing. You're trying to find a way to get into that zone as quickly as you can. So
that's
again, breath is very important. A lot of times disconnection can also happen for performers, and I consider people who do public speaking performing, is the transference with the audience. Because if you've had a bad childhood, chances are you're going to see the audience as that judgmental parent, for instance. So I tell, try to imagine someone who's positive in your life, go out there and try to get focused on someone or something as intensely as you can on stage and get yourself out of yourself. Chances are you'll get rid of your anxiety. And anxiety is about disconnection.
That's interesting too, that anxiety is disconnection. I guess because you started talking about performers, it sort of leads me on to the thing that I also wanted to ask you about, which is because I know from a long time you were doing radio shows and you do a sort of V thing, there's a part of you that is all about that kind of presentation, being a host, performing. And how does that differ? Like how, especially when, like with radio, you can't see the audience. They're not there talking into the microphone or trying your best to somehow connect to them. Like, what techniques do you use, or is there something that you specifically? Do you have a lucky rabbit's foot that you go into radio shows with, or something? Like, what is it? Is it prayer or meditation? What is it that gets you into that?
When I did the radio show, I did radio for a few years. I usually had guests. So my goal was to just connect to the guests as quickly as possible. And when I would start, let's say, it was always that countdown, 30 seconds to be on the air, and then, 30 seconds to get anxious. No, it's so interesting. No matter how many years you do it, you still have those butterflies in your stomach. But the second that music would start, I would just abandon myself into the moment and allow myself to speak and try to connect to the guest that was opposite me. And many times, if I didn't have a guest, I would speak to the technician or the engineer in the booth, because I always work better when I have a connection that way. With radio, it's interesting because you don't really realize all the people that are listening to you, because you're in a bubble, you're in this little studio, and then the people, suddenly you get calls and you realize, oh, this is Mark and he's calling from Edinburgh. And you go, oh my God, there are people actually listening all over the place. So It's a very different experience. But for me, performing has always been about connecting. One of the things I loved about it is I get to connect in a bigger, more profound way to people around me, or to, like, I'm the kind of guy who loves speaking in front of an audience, because I love that experience of, I have all these people that I can create this powerful experience. So my goal is that it's not me in the audience, but how do I work this so we all feel it? So there's this powerful sort of sense of oneness, and it gives me a greater sense of myself, and it forces me to be in that moment. So I've always loved that experience of performing. I believe it was very therapeutic growing up, because with all the mess that was going on in my life, you can't bring that onto the stage if you're going to be able to perform. So it's a powerful experience. And it's a powerful experience to connect to yourself, and through that to connect to your audience. Because all you have, whether performing on radio or you said TV, or podcasts, all you really have is yourself. So you can't connect to yourself. It's very hard to connect to other people. They don't feel the passion or the connection.
So also, I guess the question I would ask is, because you're seeing all these people all day, once you're finished with work, do you actually want to connect with another human being just for fun? Or are you an introvert where you then have to sit with a wet tea towel on your head and re-energize. Do you still enjoy connecting to people?
I always love people. So, but I need sort of an interim space. I started walking to work about 2 miles. I actually walk home from work 2 miles. And I put on my ear pods and I listen to music. Usually it's dark, walk in safer places. And I use that period as a downtime. If I'm not ready to go home, I may sit there's a park I pass, I may sit in the park. I may work out a little bit. I try to make sure that the connection, unless there's an emergency with the patient, that the connections in the evening are different. So It's more about socializing. It's more about connecting to friends, etc., and not about work.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
And that's what rejuvenates.
I guess that leads me to, because we should cover the negative side of it. Do you believe that there's such a thing as a connection you shouldn't have, connections you should avoid? And what are those kind of red flags for you when you're deciding, I don't want to connect with this person? I'm presuming that there are people that you don't want to connect to, and even patients that you don't want to see.
It's a great question, because if you sort of develop this sensitivity or this intuitive nature to try to connect to people, you got to connect to yourself in order to connect to people. You also make yourself vulnerable to connecting to a lot of negative energy and a lot of toxic people. So what I find to do, if I find myself in it, I'm very, very protective over my energy. What I mean is, if I'm in a toxic situation or a toxic relationship with a friend, I always ask myself, can I afford to be there? Because if I can't be available to myself, I'm not going to be available to my clients. I'm not going to be available to the people who I care about. So I know my energy is limited in how much I can give. And I feel very protective of that, people when they're toxic. What I talked to you earlier about, if you start feeling very negative, you start feeling very confused, if you start feeling like you're being drawn into a place that you really don't like, chances are you need to disconnect from that experience and not feel guilty about it or any kind of shame about it. To me, it's about self-care. You've got to take care of yourself, and you've got to be willing to let go of negative situations. Now, that could be a process of letting go of a negative situation, but you start understanding, it's kind of like data. You're very limited in how much data you can store. So you want to make sure that you're storing the right amount and the best quality to the best of your ability. Sometimes you don't have a choice, but to your best of your ability.
I think I'm trying to remember, was it Mark Manson? I can't remember who wrote the book on this, but you've only got so many fucks to give.
God, that call that energy. Sums it up so much better, doesn't it? All this intellectual talk, you just say, you can only fuck so much.
You've only got so many fucks to give. And as you get older, you've used them up. You've only got there's a TikTok person I listen to sometimes. She says you've got a bucket of fucks when you're born, and you've only got so many.
Exactly.
And she talks about it like you're unloading them from people that are difficult. And you're like, oh man, I can't deal with that. And you start emptying this damn bucket because it's so heavy and you can't carry it anymore, and you're getting older and you don't, whatever. These kind of metaphors I really love. When
I love them too. They're so wonderfully visual, and you can have so much fun with them.
Yeah,
I kind of let myself entertain myself, like not in a psychotic way, but you'll say something like that, and I'll visualize it. And part of me, we talk about connection, wants to go, you shouldn't be doing that, or you're a doctor, and that's not who you should be. And I always think that feeling that you need to be yourself is just so important, and that is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. It's almost other people's view of what a doctor should be. Well, you're a human first. You're merely trained to be a doctor.
I had a great super when I was going through training. When you're young and going through training, you want to be very clinical. And I had this patient, I was being all this clinical language and trying to show off to him that I knew what I had studied. And he turned to me and said, "What are you talking about?" And he used the word F. He goes, "What the fuck are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I'm talking about that patient." He says, "Talk to me in English. Tell me how you felt about it. Tell me how you experienced the patient. Don't just give me," he says, "I want to know who you are." And that was a very powerful experience for me. So I try to hold on to that. And it's all relative depending on who you're working with, how much that you could express. Sometimes it might take a year to express that to a client, but I believe people come to us for a real relationship. That's what they're seeking. And if they could experience it in the office, which is a microcosm, maybe they can take it out into the world.
It's kind of what I love about the storytelling work that I do with groups is that I think that's the tool, and it's this tool to get us closer to that. You know, people talk about to create a relationship, you need to show some vulnerability. Well, how do you show some vulnerability without it being too vulnerable, like too scary, where the risk starts to become huge? And when you talked about, you know, your kind of supervisor or whatever, and how they connected with you, and they essentially said, "Here's permission to be you and show me who you are. I want to know, like, you're in front of me.
I want to know who you are."
Yeah. But it makes me think of, because I sort of get frustrated every time I go on some kind of business thing or webinar or that kind of stuff. And we ran something at one point. I remember we ran it once where it was more kind of one-to-many, where we kind of lectured, and that was uncomfortable. We didn't really like it. And then the next one, we started it by everybody doing the story of their name, and that got everybody talking. And then we could talk about what the theme was and the sort of lecture part of it. And then when we asked, did anybody have questions, everybody was comfortable to speak. They knew who was in the room, and that pulls us out. That's what I feel we should be using more in our day-to-day life, but it's easier to do on a Zoom call, and I'm practiced at it and making people comfortable with that stuff, so I'm sort of practiced with it. I know how to do that, but I don't know how I would do that if I was being interviewed for a job. You know, you can't really go, look, I want both of us to get to know each other. We need to, you know, I'm going to give you a timer, 2 minutes, and going to just tell the story of your name, Mr. Interviewer. And I'm going to do the same for you so that you get to know who I am. That would seem a bit weird. But, and I guess the more we can find ways to tell small personal stories in our communication and our, you know, every time we meet somebody, the more likely they will be able to tell us, and we give them space to tell us their stories, even though it's nothing about the work that we're actually doing at the time, you know, the project, the task, the thing, the reason why we're meeting, that there's value in that. And I think sometimes people sort of forget that there's value in that. Like, you're meeting with that person. It's not just because you're on that project and they're the software guy, or that project and they're the marketing guy. It's like, you've chosen that one. So get to know that individual.
Yeah, I agree with you, because one of the things I believe people do that is a mistake in a business situation or a job interview is they compartmentalize it and they go in their head, well, this is a business interview, so I have to give them my business person. Yeah, to a certain extent, but you can also give them yourself. And it is in the energy that you sort of connect with the person. Like, if you're going for an interview, you actually have some control, because in your answers, it's not just about the content, it's about your enthusiasm, the feeling you bring to things. You know, are you trying to connect with the person that's interviewing you? Because in the end, we're all human beings. I believe that it's a mistake sometimes, a lot of times, to place such rigid lines on experiences and just look at them more in their totality. You know, very quickly, something that happened recently, I was in Santa Fe, and I played with the idea of perhaps maybe buying a piece of property there. So I found this really great real estate agent. She was taking us around. And we went to this house that I actually liked, and there was a woman there by herself. And I started, you know, I liked her. I started to talk to her a little bit, and she just burst out in tears and was telling me she just got divorced and she has an eating disorder and all this stuff. And the real estate agent was there, and she was looking at this. I was very polite, and I laughed, and she looked at me and she goes, "What was that all about?" I said, "Well, I just tried to connect to her, and I guess she's going through a really hard time." And she said, "Well, what do you do?" I said, "I'm a psychologist." She goes, "Well, that explains it." She goes, "You have this really calming, wonderful energy about you. I picked it up the first time we met. So I'm not surprised she reacted to you that way." To me, it was such an interesting observation, you know, sort of insight into not separating things. Because really, I was just there to look at her house. She started opening up, and I just engaged her. Maybe I helped her out a little bit. That energy is so powerful between people.
Yeah. And also, though, the real estate agent trusted you and didn't shut it down. Didn't go, let's be able to...
I think she was just like, I was pretty surprised by it too. It didn't go on for that long, but I think she was just kind of hit by it. But again, it illustrated to me how our energy is so important that we bring to a situation.
Yeah.
And to be conscious of it.
Well, I think we've talked enough to make an episode out of this. And so I'll ask you, have you got any questions for me or anything that you want to bring up?
Yeah. I think it's so important now more than any time that we've been in to find that way to connect in the deepest way possible, because the world is a mess. We are going through some extremely difficult times with difficult political situations coupled onto it, polarization, which is the opposite of connection of our country. And I am experiencing personally a lot of anxiety. I experience tremendous amount of anxiety from my patients. And to stay conscious about connection is such an important part of having positive mental outlook and positive mental health. And I believe the challenges now are even greater than most of us have experienced in our life, because on top of all the daily stuff that we've always dealt with, mortgages and payments and kids and all that stuff and relationships, we've got these huge issues that in some ways are out of our control. And we've got to find a way to heighten our ability to stay connected during these times. So all the stuff that you're talking about is so important, especially combining sort of the physical connection with the mental connection. And I can't think of a time that would be more important to stay disconnected. That was a Freudian slip. I couldn't think of a more important time to stay connected. Well, disconnected is one way of dealing with things, but ultimately that's going to get you in trouble and could ultimately lead to issues of drugs, alcohol, etc., which is sort of a heightened use of disconnection, which is an illness of disconnection. Stress how important it is during this time to stay as connected as we can to ourselves and the people around us that we care about and love and want to nurture those relationships, because that's what is ultimately going to get us through this time.
Cool. All right. Thank you for that.
My name is Howard Gluss. The thing I've noticed today is I really enjoy the connection through humor and having fun. To me, fun is one of the most important things we can do in our lives, and that is such a powerful experience for me and a powerful way to connect. My favorite way of saying goodbye is, I'll see you later.
And I'll see you later too. So, listener, I hope you've noticed Howard is awesome. You can connect to him via his website, darnothealth.com. I'll put that in the show notes. And you can connect to me via the show's website, connectionrequested.com. If you like this podcast, please share it. And of course, review it on your favourite podcast player. But most of all, just keep having fun making the best of connections. Thank you.